something we need more of in every mind and heart in Washington. Thank you for being my friend and my supporter for so many years. Mr. Mayor, thank you for having me here. Reverend Toombs, thank you for praying over us. We all need it. There's so many politicians here, you probably should have prayed longer. Colonel Paul, thank you for proving you don't have to be a politician to do good and make a good talk. Braylon, thanks for not proving to me that you're a great linebacker. I was afraid if you put a hit on me, I wouldn't make this speech. We're proud of you. And my longtime friend Cecil Alexander, with whom I worked, laughed, and occasionally fought. Back when we thought politics was a noble profession and you could disagree and still love each other. And I love you and I thank you for everything you've done. I also want to thank the 3 people who told me I had to come here today. Your county judge wrote me a nice letter, it seemed like 100 years ago now, telling me I had to come. My friend Joe Gerard, who used to be a high-tone lawyer with Hillary down in Little Rock, said he was raising cattle up here and I had to come. And Carl Garner, whose annual cleanup was our way of marking the passage of the years in Arkansas when I was governor, told me if he could live to the 50th anniversary, I had to show up. And it's my understanding that he saved this podium for us, for which we were all grateful. Now, the last time I did a public event like this outside in this community was not too far from here when one of your bridges had blown down in a tornado. And the federal government gave us the money and it got built back. And Dale Bumpers and I came up here to dedicate the bridge. And whether you believe it or not, when you're fanning yourself, this is a frigid day compared to that summer day. It was 95 degrees if it was 1, and that's before we're all standing, instead of where y'all are standing, we're all standing on the bridge. New pavement is like a glass. The sun was baking off of it. And I looked at Bumpers and I said, we're going to kill these people if we give speeches. I'll bet you $5 I can give a shorter speech. He said, you got to bet. He neglected to read the program. He was speaking before me. Dale Bumpers got up and gave a 1 minute and 15 second speech. And then I followed him and talked 45. On that day, we could have been elected king for life. And in front of the whole crowd, he took out his billfold and gave me my $5, which I have saved to this very day. First, to echo something Governor Beebe had said and to try to put my remarks into some context, I'm very grateful to whoever planned this program for putting in the program the exact remarks that President Kennedy gave. Because you see what's relevant to today and how different today is. I urge you to read them. For the young people who are here, the students, the color guard, the Boy Scouts who helped, for their sakes, we should put this day in the context of what this day was like 50 years ago. When President Kennedy was here with all of our congressional delegation except for Congressman Harris, I had recently turned 17. The Depression, which lasted 11 years till the outbreak of World War II, actually almost 12 years, was fresh in the minds of everybody who got up here and spoke. The war was fresh in the minds of everyone who got up here and spoke. And for the members of our congressional delegation, all of whom were older than President Kennedy, they remembered what we did and did not do between the wars. And Kennedy, who had lived in England, thought about the failures of the years between World War I and World War II. So even though he was just a boy growing up, the years from World War II, World War I to 1963 were embedded in his experience, in his mind, his imagination. A very different time than most of us have experienced. The Depression especially shaped Arkansas. 25% of the country was unemployed, but it hurt us so bad that at the end of World War II, even after the war had brought the country out of depression, the per capita income of our little state was only 56% of the national average, barely half the national average. When President Roosevelt came here in the Depression to celebrate our centennial in 1936, his route was mapped out in advance, and the people of Arkansas were proud. They wanted the president to see the best of our state, and they knew he was going to drive down some country roads and into some little towns. And so they wanted to make sure every house he saw, even in the Depression, even with our unemployment rate worse than national average, looked good. But there wasn't enough paint to paint every house. So the people of this state, you should be very proud of this, at least painted the front of every house that Franklin Roosevelt drove by to show respect for the president and self-respect for the communities involved. All this stuff was part of our life. My grandfather, who ran a little country store, thought he was, in the Depression, worked on the back of an ice truck back when refrigerators were really ice boxes. He weighed 150 pounds and could carry around a 200-pound block of ice on his back. And he thought he was going to Roosevelt when he died. Because at the time we believed that for all of our political differences, we could only survive tough times and make better times if in the end we found some way to come together, some way that benefited everybody who was willing to work hard. And somehow, I think if President Kennedy were here today, he'd ask us to try to get that done again. He would be about Carl Garner's age, even a little older. But he would still be talking, as he did 50 years ago, about the future. Thanks to you and the Arkansas Boys State program, I shook hands with John Kennedy, as Mike Beebe said, just 9 weeks before he came here at the American Legion Boys Nation program. On the day I was inaugurated president, my mother asked me to take her to the spot in the Rose Garden where I was standing when I shook hands with John Kennedy. That's the first thing my mother did when her little boy got elected president. President Kennedy came here about 10 weeks later. Between the time he came here and the time I met him, 5 weeks almost to the day, there was a great civil rights march in Washington where Martin Luther King gave what I believe is the greatest political speech given by any American in the 20th century. To a crowd that Americans, because we were so divided over this civil rights legislation, were terrified would be violent, but was completely peaceful. And he asked the African Americans there to reach out a hand in friendship to the white majority, whether they were for them or against them. He said, whether we like it or not, we got to go forward together. We need to show the dignity that undeserved suffering can bring to people by being genuine friends. Nobody talks like that anymore, do they? Whatever side they're on any debate, you know. You can't imagine a guy who literally had his life threatened and later had his life taken standing up and say, there's value in undeserved suffering. It purifies your soul. Reach out and grab somebody by the hand and say, we got to go forward together. Then 5 weeks after that, President Kennedy shows up here. You read the speech. I won't read it for you. But he pointed out that thanks to the contributions of our congressional delegation, which had more seniority than any other in the country, where we had in the House 3, not 1, 3 committee chairmen, and Took Athings, who'd been in Congress almost 30 years by then, was still the number 2 guy on the Agriculture Committee because the Congress from Mississippi had been there 2 years longer than he had. But he had enormous influence. John McClellan was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Bill Fulbright was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Fulbright had been chairman of the Banking Committee. McClellan would become chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, the most powerful committee in the Senate. And he said, you know, this seniority system has led to some bad things that I don't approve of, but it does give us people, if they're responsible and care about the future, the ability to make decisions that are good not just for this generation, but down the road. And then he said, he did, as you heard the governor say, single out Congressman Mills, his daughter's here today with us, and we thank her for being here. And he said he wanted me to come dedicate this dam. I said, Wilbur, you just helped me pass my tax reform bill. I'll go down there and sing down by the old mill stream if you want me to. It's the only joke in the speech, and a good one, because it had the virtue of being true. Why am I telling you that? There was a lot of fighting going on. Governor Faubus had to host President Kennedy. They were on polar opposites of the civil rights debate. So what happened? Kennedy was gracious to Faubus by talking about how they both believed in land conservation, and he complimented what Arkansas had done and how it reinforced what he was trying to do and what Franklin Theodore Roosevelt had tried to do. And Faubus, who didn't like the president, brought his father along, who did. Orville Faubus's father was the most liberal public figure in the history of the state of Arkansas. He made Dale Bumpers and David Pryor and me look like we were, you know, over there with Barry Goldwater. And he wrote wonderful essays. He had no education, but he wrote wonderful, eloquent essays to the Arkansas Gazette under the pseudonym of Jimmy Higgins. The students here ought to pull them up on the internet. You can get them now. And Sam Faubus was so happy to be there. And after this ceremony, they had a little lunch. And Orville Faubus was responsible for hosting the president, so he made sure his daddy sat next to the president and they could have a talk. Why am I saying this? Because they were trying to figure out how to make things work. They never, with all the fights they had going on, would let the government shut down or let the country default on its debts and hurt us in the face of the rest of the world. Because they thought, now, as President Kennedy said, there were things wrong with it. What about all the other states? What about all the smart people who hadn't been in Congress 20 years? What about all the voices that got shut out? We are more democratic, small d, than we were then. There are more opportunities for more voices. Power in America is more diffuse. You don't even have to be in elected office anymore to have real influence. But we have to remember that sooner or later, we have to make a decision as a people that is good for our common future and get the show on the road. And what President Kennedy said was that decisions that were being made beginning in the New Deal and the Depression led so many years later to the dedication of the Greers Ferry Dam. And that the dedication was just the beginning of the benefits, which, as you have proved, continue down to the present day in drinking water, in electricity, in tourism revenues, and people coming here. It just keeps going on and on. And I will say again, we think these are wherever we're living, we always think whatever we're doing is the most extreme example of whatever happened, good or bad, that ever happened. This country has had a lot of tough political fights. And everything John Kennedy did and said here was existing at the same time as these brutal political battles over whether we would have a Civil Rights Act, whether we would have a Voting Rights Act, whether we would have an Open Housing Act. So we're fighting over the Voting Rights Act again after 50 years. This is normal. This is what has always shaped America. But what makes a democracy work is if there are some things that people decide they won't do, even though they can, because it compromises the future of our children and the character of our country. And there's some set of forces that remind us none of us are perfect, none of us are right all the time, but we do have an obligation to give our kids a better chance to shape their futures and live their dreams. And that requires us sooner or later to get the show on the road. I have marveled at the ability of Governor Beebe and the Republican majority in the legislature to get the show on the road. That's important. And I say this because of the young people who are here, people who have more tomorrows than yesterday. Those of us who have more yesterdays than tomorrows owe them that. We owe them a future. And if you read President Kennedy's speech, you realize that he was obsessed with trying to honor the future. You realize that he believed that between World War II and World War I and World War II, we had a depression and we drove the world into a Second World War because we neglected that. Because people thought we did not have to work together to build the future. Because we thought everything would just take care of itself and we could go about our business and have our fights or pursue our own destinies, and we could ignore that. And Kennedy's life lesson was based on the life he had lived, which included some time floating around in the Pacific after they shot his boat out from under him. The thing I loved about World War II heroes is they all lowballed what they did. He said, I wasn't a hero. I got a medal because they shot my boat out from under me. He knew that the way to avoid having things like that happen in the future was finding a way both to continue vigorous debate and eventually to come together and build a common future. We are a more diverse country than we ever been. It's our meal ticket to the 21st century. We can't get away from the rest of the world. And the real great test of our time is whether we can build a common future of shared responsibilities and shared prosperity, or we're going to build a common future of constant conflict with nobody finally saying, okay, let's keep fighting about this, but how can we get the show on the road? John Kennedy died 1 month and 19 days after he left this podium. He could not have known that he just had that long to live. He gave an enormous amount of thought to what he wanted to be doing when he was my age now, and even older. But it was not to be. And because his life was claimed too soon, in death he became, for all the rest of us, and at least Mike Beebe's generation and mine, the symbol of the eternal future. The symbol of what we always had to become. And that America was always going to be a country on the move, always becoming, always redefining itself. not having no political debates, not having no fights, but always finding a way to find something we agreed on, something we should continue fighting on, and some way to keep moving together into tomorrow. So for the rest of my life, since you were kind enough to have me here today, whenever I drive over one of these bridges, I will remember a president who took time to be with young people in a Boys State program, who took time to come down here and was willing to sing down by the old mill stream, who took time to share his life conviction based on the experience of his generation that the future does not happen by accident. It is chosen by real life, flesh and blood, imperfect but well-motivated people. And it will always remind me that our obligations now, no less than then, are to give our children, our grandchildren, that future. We are going to share it. The question is what we will share, and that is ours to determine. John Kennedy said that on this day, extolling this fabulous project. And that is the lasting gift that his life and his death gave us. Thank you very much.